If you enjoy watching Lakeland Public Television programming online, please make a tax-deductible contribution at lptv.org. Your support is what makes this web content possible. Thank you.
Boardwalks to Bike Paths was made possible by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota. "10,000 years ago, much of the Midwestern United States and Canada was covered by a massive glacier that was more than a mile thick. As the last ice sheet slowly retreated, it vastly altered the continent's topography, carving out the pristine landscapes we know today as Minnesota's land of 10,000 lakes. Northern Minnesota is abundant with natural beauty, rich history, and culture. But many of the land's most valuable treasures would be long lost and forgotten if not for the foresight of pioneers who championed the preservation of natural resources and established northern Minnesota's state parks. From 90,000 acres of unbroken peatlands to 200-year-old pine forests, from scenic mountain bike trails to the source of the mighty Mississippi, these sanctuaries provide a home for Minnesotans to do what they do best: explore the great outdoors. The retreat of the area's last glacier also created Lake Agassiz, which is believed to have been the largest freshwater lake in the world. In northwestern Minnesota, the bed of glacial Lake Agassiz is now home to the largest unbroken peatland in the United States and the Big Bog State Recreation Area.
Big Bog is relatively a new park. It was established in the year 2000. It's located on the eastern shore of Upper Red Lake. The Red Lake peatlands, what the locals have called the Big Bog for many years.
It's 585 square miles. It's huge. It's very vast. The Red Lake peatlands are a blanket bog. Originally this was the bed of glacial Lake Agassiz. And then after the lake receded, about 8,000 years ago, the climate cooled and then sphagnum moss started growing and it created its own environment. So it's very acidic, very cool, very wet. And the moss just keeps building upon itself. And because it is so acidic, it doesn't really decompose, it just keeps building and building. There are places where it's up to 21 feet deep, and thus the term blanket bog. It's the largest unbroken peatlands in the contiguous United States. It started out with overexploitation of the natural resources in this area.
In the late 90s, when the walleye fishery in the lake here collapsed, all the resort businesses were all closed in Waukesha, and so we were trying to figure out some ways to get some economic development in the area.
So we went through a visioning process, and about 60 people from the community all worked together, came up with a list of projects, things that we would like to see happen in this area. You know, where do we want it to be in 10 years? What can we do to make this better? And to my surprise, the creation of a state park focused on the Big Bog topped the list.
So we've started working on drawing up a concept plan and then presented it to the legislature in the spring of 2000. And lo and behold, they approved it. So, but it was a really quick deal. We started it in June of '99, and by the spring of 2000 we had established a state recreation area.
This park is all about resource protection and providing opportunity for people who want to learn more about it.
So the boardwalk was created to make an area which was previously inaccessible accessible. It's a mile in length. You can see it's entirely handicap accessible, so it provides an easy access out to the bog, which, you know, before this was pretty hard to get out to. And it was something that hadn't been done before. So we wanted to make sure a quality product was designed. So it was designed in-house by DNR engineers. The bog it's a very fragile place, so we wanted to make sure that we didn't impact the area we were trying to protect. So, and one of the ways of doing that was to develop the bog block end over end on top of itself. We would bring a section of 16-foot decking out onto the boardwalk, secure it down through the the peatland soil, which varied from about 1.5 to 14 feet, and then hoist another section over on top of that and just work end from end until we got out to the mile end of the boardwalk. We wanted to make sure that the boardwalk would allow vegetation to grow up underneath it, and it was determined we need at least 65% of the sunlight to pass through. And, you know, it's a one-of-a-kind boardwalk. It hadn't been done in the past, so we weren't really sure if it was going to work, but it's really worked out well. You can see some of the plants are growing through it right now. We've had requests from across the country to try to duplicate it. It's low enough to the ground, folks can get on their hands and knees and look at the rare plants out there. It's the largest bog boardwalk in the nation, so it's a nice feature here.
There's a whole bunch of different kinds of peat. Most of the peat in this area is sphagnum peat, and sphagnum moss. That is really the driving factor of what created the Red Lake peatlands. Sphagnum is an amazing plant. It'll hold 32 times its volume in water. So all of this peat that we have up in this area and the moss, if you were to squeeze it like a big sponge, the cubic feet or acre feet of water that you would squeeze out of this area, it's enough to put a half a foot of water over the entire state of Minnesota. This is an extremely sensitive landscape. You make a disturbance in the peatlands and it stays for a very long time, the impacts of what you've done. There are still very apparent the caribou migration trails, and the caribou haven't been here for over 150 years.
Back around the turn of the century, 1900s, there was a lot of interest in this area. Probably a lot of it was interest by the timber companies. They were interested in ways to be able to get at some of the valuable timber that was out in this area. So they put on a promotion effort that tried to get some roads in. It was around that time too that there was a lot of immigrants were coming in from Europe looking for places to live. And so then at the same time, then they come with the idea that this was going to drain the bog and that they were going to open it up for farmland. They had several of these machines for digging the ditches. One of them was what they called the floating dredge. They'd bring the machine out in pieces probably over during the winter time, and then they would dig a hole there, and then they would set it in the hole, and then when the hole filled up with water, it would start floating. And so then they would start digging and the water would follow them right up. It wasn't engineered properly to do a real drainage job. The homesteading idea didn't pan out. The land really wasn't farmable. So the homesteaders started leaving. There was 1,500 miles of these ditches were dug. And that you still see the areas where the ditches were, but that's a natural process. In fact, this bog here is growing all the time. It's expanding its territory. It's getting higher and higher all the time. And it's continuing to take that water level right on up with it as it goes. In enough time, I believe the bog will take over Red Lake, because Red Lake's only 12 feet deep. This is changing all the time. It's a living organism out here. It's a tremendous amount of life here, even as desolate as it seems, until you really get out in it and you see all the amazing things and the variety of stuff that's out here that don't exist anywhere else. It's just, it's amazing. If you're interested in the beauty of nature, you'll find it out here.
It's had very little disturbance. It's a very naturally intact ecosystem, and it's truly a wild place.
So if water is the lifeblood of this earth, this is the heart right here. It is the last true wilderness.
Minnesota's glacial prehistory is also responsible for the formation of the Mississippi River, which runs through the heart of our country. Minnesota's oldest state park, nestled among rolling hills, is the home of one of the only old-growth forests in the state, and is where the Mississippi River begins its 2,500-mile journey to the Gulf of Mexico. Attracting 500,000 visitors annually, Itasca State Park was founded by visionary Jacob Brower.
Even back in the 1890s, people were seeing the foresight of protecting resources such as this pine forest and the Mississippi River for future generations. Jacob Brower actually spent his own personal money to help purchase land to get this park established. Itasca State Park has a rich history. Many people who visit here only know the history from when homesteaders began living here in the 1890s. But archaeologists have done extensive work in our park, and we have evidence of people that have been here 9,000 years ago or 8,000 years ago in, and the woodland people who moved in and hunted the smaller game such as white-tailed deer and incorporated the use of the bow and arrow and burial mounds that are located within the park. So a lot of features that tell a much more ancient story of people who've been drawn to the river, just like the explorers were drawn to the river, the homesteaders were drawn to the river, and like I tell visitors, the same reason we're drawn to the river.
Here at Itasca, you can actually walk across the headwaters of the Mississippi River. Of course, it grows and grows fast to the point where there are places where it's a mile across.
I always brag to my friends in Louisiana about coming to Itasca State Park. It's an awesome park of all the walking and hiking, bike trails and all that, but the headwaters is the place everybody wants to go, to the headwaters, and especially us, we brag a lot. You know, we're spending our winters at the mouth of the Mississippi and at the headwaters during our summer, so we're kind of proud of that.
Our Mississippi River channel here in Itasca looks a lot like it did when Schoolcraft was here in 1832. Lake Itasca is a tunnel valley. It's an underglacial river. So the glacial history has a lot to do with the formation of our river. And a lot of people say too, you know, well, where did it get its name? Well, the Michizzibi or the Gitchizzibi is the great river spread over a large area. It has been named that by the Ojibwa people and the people of the Algonquian dialect. And so that river has always kept its name as the Great River. At Itasca State Park, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft is credited with discovering the source of the Mississippi River on July 13th of 1832. But Schoolcraft couldn't have done it alone. He actually was in the area in 1820. He came on the Governor Cass expedition to Cass Lake, and he asked the Indian guides that were with, is this really the source? Because he saw two other rivers coming into Cass Lake. So Schoolcraft had to sit on it until 1832. He was then commissioned by Cass himself, who was now Secretary of War. He said, go back to that area and work with the Indian cultures there. They vaccinated them for smallpox, but also he was working with the Dakota and Ojibwa people who were struggling over hunting and gathering rights. And when Schoolcraft came here, he was very fortunate to come across Ozawindib, an Ojibwa who was traveling to Michilimackinac on Lake Superior, and he asked him, do you know where the source is? So Ozawindib actually agreed to turn his canoe party around and loan canoes to Schoolcraft on the expedition, and he guided Schoolcraft here to Lake Itasca on July 13th. But can you really say you discovered something if someone's already leading you to that location? And so the real credit goes to the Ojibwa people and the Indian cultures that use the Mississippi River. And when he came to Lake Itasca, its name was not Itasca. It was actually Amushkus, which refers to red deer or elk-like. But when he was here, he felt that this great lake should have a more majestic name because it is the beginning of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi is the heart of our nation. And so with him was Reverend Boutwell. And Boutwell said, there is the word veritas, which means truth or true, and caput, which means head or source. So Schoolcraft looked at that, shortened up the two words, pushed it together, and created the name Itasca, which means true source or true head. And so what you can say is Schoolcraft is the first one to write it down and publish it. And so that is why he gets the credit for discovering the source. But people questioned it. And that whole glacial history ties into the confusion that the explorers have because they were used to thinking of rivers starting in a mountain. They thought this land was flat. And so they commissioned Jacob Brouwer to explore the landscape. He kind of created the watershed theory, surveying the topography or that elevation change and determining that this glacier made rolling hills and that river follows right and hugs right along the edge of that sand hill that divides and separates two major watersheds in Minnesota. And so Brouwer said all this water in Itasca's basin rolls down into the bottom, like on the bottom of a saucer. And here in Lake Itasca is the bottom of that saucer, and only here at the north end where the river flows out is the surface flow and volume large enough to be a river. So Schoolcraft's discovery, as he called it, just didn't have the science behind it, and Brouwer provided that science. But I think the most interesting thing about that whole exploration story is it is partly and leads into why our park was created, because in 1888 and 1889, when Jacob Brower was here, he saw the beautiful pine forest that is known for Itasca. He saw how our state was being logged off, and he wanted to preserve and protect this pine landscape, the Mississippi River, and the lakes in our park. And so he helped to establish Itasca State Park by proposing a bill, and in 1891, on April 20th, Itasca State Park became Minnesota's oldest state park. The legislature in 1891, they allocated very little money. He was given something like $60 a month for 3 months. That was to last for an entire year. It was to pay his salary, purchase land from the private homesteaders and the lumber companies that had ownership on the land, because we were just a park on paper. A lot of the land was owned by other private individuals, and so he had to work with very nominal amounts of money. So he used a lot of diplomacy, but a lot of his own time and money to help develop it. And not a lot of people do that. And there were several homesteads along the east lake shore of Itasca. And so visitors were coming to Itasca even before we were officially a park. And some of these private homes would provide rooms for people, but it never provided enough room for the volume of people that were coming. Several thousand people would sometimes come to the region. And when it became a park, they recognized that we needed a lodge to help house the visitors that were coming here. And so in 1905, Douglas Lodge was officially opened for visitors to come and stay.
The Itasca State Park Douglas Lodge building is the oldest surviving building in Minnesota State Parks. It has lodging and it has a full-service kitchen. It's rustic dining in a casual atmosphere, and it's very unique, and people come from near and far to dine here. Well, some of the challenges we face on a building that's over 100 years old are keeping it maintained. And we work to ensure that the buildings are like the original blueprints because they're historic. You get modern building materials, but you have to make them fit the period. The park maintains an average level of about 500,000 visitors a year. So you have a certain deal of wear and tear on your facilities. Then the other challenges are maintaining over 100 log and stone buildings in the park. So there's a constant cycle of maintenance, and you have to work within those parameters of a historic structure. What it does for the visitor when they see these buildings, it's like stepping back in time. You go into the great room in Douglas Lodge with the stone fireplace and the wicker furniture, the rocking chair. It's like turning back the clock, and they can envision what it was like before electricity, when you had fireplace light and kerosene lanterns. So I think they enjoy stepping back 110 years ago to see what life might have been like. When they come here and they see these giant old growth pine, they can think back to pre-settlement times before there weren't so many humans on this planet, and I think that's what our visitors enjoy the most.
The attraction for me at Itasca is the old growth forest, the pine trees. To work and actually have that opportunity to walk through those forests makes me feel young. It makes me feel small. The trees are so big and dwarf human beings. They're so old that they live longer, much longer than anyone that's on the planet today. And it gives me a feeling of what's been happening in the past.
Preacher's Grove is a grove of old growth trees at Itasca State Park. An old growth forest is a forest that has had very little evidence of human disturbance. These are trees that would not have been harvested by logging, and still maintain the structural complexity of a forest that would have been here before European settlement. These are primarily red pine and white pine trees, and they are around 200 years old and just a very unique, picturesque stand. I am in charge of 32,000 acres of old growth trees, and one of the primary focuses of my job is to regenerate the old growth pine in the park. It's complicated to maintain old trees and to regenerate new ones at the same time, especially trees that like a lot of light. So you can imagine growing small trees underneath the shade of older existing trees is difficult, especially with limitations to our ability to do certain things in the park. Logging is something that people don't come here to see a logged site, but it's a tool that could be used to regenerate forests. Fire is another one. People don't come to the forest to see a blackened landscape, but these forests are dependent on disturbance to regenerate. A lot of the pine forests that we work with here originated with catastrophic fire. So we have trouble in the park with our natural regeneration in that sense. On July 2nd, 2012, we had a major windstorm event roll through northern Itasca State Park all the way to Bemidji. We saw very significant damage in terms of trees blown down across roads, in the campgrounds, onto buildings in some cases. In terms of the natural resource, we here at the park had limited damage, and so it could have been much worse. We did aerial surveys and aerial photography, and 98% of the trees in the park are just fine. It was a wonderful thing that there were no injuries in the park, both during the storm itself, which must have been very scary for people here, but in the recovery from the storm, the weeks of cleanup, we have had 0 injuries, which has been outstanding. Mostly it could be thought of as a natural disturbance event, kind of a natural thinning of the trees here at the park. We have to manage society's needs as well as the needs of the ecosystem at the same time, and that presents a philosophical problem as well as a management problem. We're probably never going to prescribe a catastrophic fire in this forest, just simply based on the idea that we can't control something like that, and we have a lot of people and structures and important things around the park. So how do you deal with that? Well, you use the tools that are available to you, and that may be prescribing less intense fires combined with some mechanical help. We may have to use some logging or machinery in the forest to start to regenerate them. And that may not seem pleasant at first, but if we do it correctly, we may be able to perpetuate the important parts of this, which is the ecosystem function. And it takes a lot of careful planning, but if we're persistent, my hope is that we can be successful.
One of my favorite things about being a naturalist is when you see the light bulb come on, when someone makes that connection with nature and they can feel that that location is even more special than just a park to come and see, that they're making a personal connection with the site. For example, I had a group of people from Louisiana come up, and right away they were like, I never knew that about the Mississippi River, and I've lived along it my whole life. And just seeing that excitement, just like a little kid again, then you know that you're a success.
The Mississippi River continues its journey across the state of Minnesota, gaining in size and momentum from other streams and lakes. It converges with the Crow Wing River almost in the exact center of the state at Crow Wing State Park.
Crow Wing State Park was established in 1959. Some of the unique things are that it represents an area where the town of Old Crow Wing used to be. We're at the confluence of 2 rivers, the Mississippi and the Crow Wing. And one of the main reasons the park was established was because of the fantastic history in this area. A lot of Native American history.
Nin Gite Witigwe Yand. That's what the Indians called this place, at least before the Europeans came, which meant place of separation. When the Europeans came, there were 2 major Indian populations, the Dakota, the Lake Dakotas, Nadawassu, sometimes called, and the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe or Chippewa, all the different names that get mispronounced by the Europeans when they're trying to understand the language. The native people were very astute in being able to determine that very early on, that this was a very important site. This is a place to live.
In native eyes, you know, there are many different kinds of resources. So wild rice, fish, you know, game, fur-bearing animals, and they're all in abundance. The topography around Crow Wing is perfectly well suited for a resource-intensive lifestyle like Ojibwe and Dakota people had. It was also at the confluence of 2 major waterways that connected much of central and northern Minnesota together. And so it was an access point for getting at many other resources. A really, really important place. And this was, in every kind of resource that you could imagine, some of the richest land in the world. And as the Ojibwe displaced the Dakota, it was contested ground for many decades. And in the center of that very place, within the boundaries of the park, you have some of the most historic Ojibwe-Dakota battles over land and territory in Minnesota. that predated European colonization.
Well, a British trader by the name of James McGill came in here in 1771 and developed the first fur trade post that was recorded that we know of. He went back to the major fur trade center at Mishlimakina and said, it's a great place to make money, basically. There's furs all over the place. And in that time of our history, the beaver pelt was worth more than gold in Europe. And you wanted to make money at it. Money was not a term that the native people really understood because they thought the white people were pretty stupid for giving them things like firearms, knives, axes that they could utilize to do better for these furs. So there were some cultural differences that showed up right away, but friendly terms was important, and that was a problem here.
For Native people, the abundance of wild rice, fish, fur-bearing animals had enabled groups like the Ojibwe to expand their territory at the expense of other tribes and increase their standard of living, even after contact with Europeans. And that went on through the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, until the fur trade really collapsed. And Native people started actually selling land to the United States government that there was any significant decrease in the standard of living that Native people had. And looking at a place like Crow Wing gives you a really great opportunity to see where that process transpired and how.
We're standing in the old Crow Wing town site, which first started in the 1820s as a fur trade post and then developed later in the 1840s as a trade center where ox cart traffic came through, connecting present-day Winnipeg to St. Paul. This building is called the Bolio House. It was built in 1849 by one of the early traders in Crow Wing named Clement Bolio. So we have the house sitting the way it had been originally, and it's just really neat to see it back in its original location and in the backdrop where it had been. The one thing you have to remember though is that that was one house in a big town. The town was basically built up in this valley area here, and the Bolio House is supposed to be one of the oldest standing structures in central Minnesota, north of the Twin Cities area.
The village of Crow Wing was the northernmost city on the Mississippi River for a long time. And it wasn't until the railroad tycoons moved the depot over to Brainerd that the town of Brainerd sprang up. Crow Wing was really the nexus of non-native activity.
The first roads in Minnesota, connecting Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Leech Lake. And then the west, Duluth. They all kind of were coming right through here. But like everything in life, politics generates its muscle once in a while. And luckily for us, it went north to Brainerd.
When Crow Wing ceased to exist in the 1870s, most of the buildings were torn down or moved.
We can see where the ruts for the old wagon road is. And that used to go right up through the village and was one of the major connection points there. And that's where Hole in the Day was actually accosted, shot, and killed. And Hole in the Day was one of the very first Ojibwe chiefs to claim to be chief of more than just one village. He claimed to be chief of an entire region. He claimed to be chief of the village of Crow Wing, which was half populated with whites. And many of the white citizens there said, yes, he's our chief, which is really a crazy development. Hole in the Day, like many tribal leaders, was in an impossible situation. You know, as soon as the first Native people sold the first tract of land, it became clear that that was unsustainable. That all of a sudden, people who relied upon all of this land to generate everything from furs to food and resources to provide for their families had less access to fewer resources. And it became a vicious cycle where then the next land sale and the next one, to the point where eventually you run out of land. Hole in the Day was no fool. He realized the situation that they were in, but in this kind of impossible environment, he found a way to maintain his political power and influence and to protect and look out for his people, probably more effectively than most tribal leaders. Hole in the Day had traveled to Washington many times. A lot of times tribal leaders waited until the government said we want to parlay or have a treaty meeting or whatever. Hole in the Day would see something going on. He'd take a carriage down to St. Paul, he'd get on the railroad, he'd go to Washington, D.C., he'd petition the president, he'd get an audience with the President of the United States, and he'd talk shop on treaties and go back home. You know, I don't know how many people of any kind of stature would assume the right to go parley with the President of the United States, but he did and succeeded in doing so. So When it came time for the White Earth Treaty, which was in 1867, some of the clauses actually called for the building of roads, a house for every native family that would move there, a sawmill, and a grist mill. And he basically told his people, and I think it was very, very wise what he said, although kind of heartbreaking at the same time. He said, there's no way to go back to the way things were, as much as we'd all like that. But there is a way forward. And the way forward is to get involved in the agriculture business. We're going to farm, we're going to process our own stuff. We will get into the timber business, and we will have modern houses for all native families who move here. He signed that treaty. And then he returned to his people and he said, whatever you do, do not move. If you move, no one's going to get a house. They won't build the sawmill, the grist mill. You won't get any of these benefits. And then Hole in the Day said, that's it. I'm going back to Washington, D.C., and I'm going to sort this out and make sure we get the terms that we've negotiated. And he's cruising down the ox cart wagon road in the Crow Wing State Park, and he gets accosted by a bunch of Ojibwe people. Then he was assassinated. And people moved. And they didn't get the houses, the sawmill, the grist mill. I think if Hole in the Day had lived, it's conceivable that something like the timber boom could have been a source of financial aid and betterment to Native communities rather than something that just eviscerated them. Looking at his life is a window into how the nature of tribal leadership changed, the story of how the land went from native to non-native hands, its politics, its Indian policy. You can see all of that happening there. And it's really a fantastic story. I mean, it's a disturbing story, but it's an amazing one, and a real live Minnesota murder mystery, and a source of great drama. By the time he gets killed, you almost have to ask not so much who had motive, it's almost who did not have motive. You know, he had a lot of very powerful enemies. You know, Native leaders who were infuriated with him, mixed blood traders who were upset, U.S. government officials who wanted to get the land and resources as fast as possible, and he was seen as an obstacle. There are lots of people who wanted him gone, but he had also very powerful friends, and I think if he had lived longer, it's very likely that the entire history of removal of indigenous people from Crow Wing to White Earth would have been very, very different. And certainly in studying the things he did right and the things he did wrong, you know, you can see echoing through the generations to the present some of the pitfalls and great talent that we have serving Indian country today. In looking at the Crow Wing State Park, it is amazing to me just how much history there is in that place, and equally amazing to me how little of it is known to most Minnesotans, even people who live right there.
The Great Depression is viewed as one of the darkest periods in the 20th century. By 1933, as many as 25% of all Americans were out of work. In his first term, President Franklin Roosevelt enacted the New Deal, focusing on relief, recovery, and reform. It was under the New Deal that the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, was established, providing conservation jobs for unmarried and unemployed men. The CCC efforts not only created jobs, but also contributed to greater public awareness of natural resources throughout the country. The Corps members helped develop many state parks, including Scenic State Park near Big Fork.
Scenic State Park was the first Minnesota state park that was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps crews in 1933. They did forest work, replanting some trees in some areas that were logged off, but also they built all these buildings like the one we're standing in now. Going way back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, there were mostly trappers and loggers living in the area. To their credit, the loggers left some of the really nice big red and white pine standing in this area. And then the people of the Big Fork area started lobbying the Minnesota State Legislature to create a state park here, which they did in 1921. Scenic State Park was established. As far as the development of the park, nothing much happened until 12 years later in 1933 with the Civilian Conservation Corps. They did very good work. There was a crew of 200 men working here for 2 years and just painstakingly constructed buildings. I mean, they're still in great shape.
Scenic State Park is special simply because of not only the scenery, but because of the people. Bill Lewis did a lot just, I think, to liven up most of the CCs, did a lot of wood carving. He did this showcase here. But this one here is interesting because everything is made out of wood, from the asters to the jack pine lady slipper and a tiger swallowtail. Made in a real nice cedar case. And of course that all sits on a beautiful burl table made from a big pine burl. Absolutely beautiful job. Bill Lewis did the majority of the furniture, and I'm sure he designed them, probably started putting them together, and probably had the rest of the CC guys finish them off. Bill Lewis also wanted to make them heavy enough and bulky enough so if they were left here, people wouldn't be able to just grab them and run off with them. So the majority of them stayed a long, long time. Another one like this bench here, they're very, very, very heavy logs. And it takes a lot to move them because you don't want to just grab them. It'll get a little flimsy. Beautiful, beautiful benches. And we have the really nice panoramic view of what can happen if you don't take care of your fire. They had painted in some pictures of the car and the vehicle and the Ranger, and then they took those pictures out because what they wanted to do is they wanted it to last forever. They didn't want to date the pictures. They wanted people to know that it was not only for back then, but it's for future generations also. The people that come here as a destination. There's a reason they come here. A camper came up, his name was Joe, and Joe said he had camped here a long time ago, and he showed me a picture of a little boy in a black Speedo on a set of stone steps, and he said, "Where are these steps?" Well, we looked around, we knew where the swimming beach was, we located a leaning cedar tree, but no stone steps. All we saw was this big, huge, washed out gravelly area, so we figured it had to be here someplace. So we looked, we found a stone at the bottom where the water was washing out. We talked to the manager and said that we think this is where the stone steps were, and he said, well, if there's stone steps there, we need to find them. It's probably built by the CCCs. He says, let's work on it. And Joe said, I want to do it. He came down here with a shovel and he cleared off these stone steps which were built by the CCCs. Now, he would not buy a new black Speedo, but he came down here and he had a new suit on and he went like this and he took another picture. And Joe just kept coming back year after year after year. And he just took great pride in the fact that he wanted to clear off and bring a part of history back again. That's a part of our CCC history that if it wasn't for campers and it wasn't for people that love the park, would have been buried for a long, long time.
We get a lot of people that come here as a real destination where they spend several days here. We're pretty far up north, so I guess that would be the reason that we're fairly secluded and fairly remote. But the people that do come here think it's worth the trip.
We kind of did a spur of the moment trip, and this is the first place that Kim could find that had 2 adjacent reservable spots. And we come here and it's like, wow, why haven't we been here before? This has been the most quiet park we've ever traveled to. We travel as couples, as friends, and it's just been blissfully quiet, and the loons are calling all the time. Last night we heard a loon calling as it flew over the top of us. Have never seen that before. You don't hear traffic, you don't hear other campers. It's just blissful.
And the fishing's good too.
The lake is very peaceful. We have a 10-mile-an-hour speed limit, and most people really appreciate that fact. It's for canoeing and kayaking and fishing, and not really for water skiing and stuff. But lots of people bring their own boats, but lots of people also just rent canoes and kayaks and rowboats from us. And the hiking is fantastic.
Chase Point Trail is our premier trail in Scenic State Park. Families and users that come back year after year always come back and have to hike Chase Point, and we'll take group pictures every year. You can watch the kids grow and you can watch the landscapes change. This is one of the favorites of every user that comes here. And I think it has a lot to do with the history of the park. The area that you see behind me, this is Sandwick Lake. And this was gouged out by the glaciers as it went further south. And this trail is on top of a large hillside, what is believed to be an esker formation, and was created when the glaciers came down. They had a river that formed through a couple of ice sheets, which gouged out this channel behind us and created this esker formation. So in the esker you'll find sand, gravel, and small boulders moved by the glaciers. With Chase Point and the sandy soils, we start getting different erosion control issues as well as out at the remote campsites. Because we do have users coming into these fragile environments, every time someone walks on an area, it changes the environment. And one of the major projects we're in the middle of right now is the end of Chase Point Trail. It's been eroding away little by little. Within the last few years, we've lost at least 1.5 feet worth of material into the lake. So this year what we've done is created erosion control blankets onto this topsoil, and we've also put in coconut logs along the shoreline to help hold in and keep that hillside from washing into the lake. And we're hoping to reestablish that with some vegetation. And then in the next step, we'll be putting in stairways and a new landing area basically for boats coming off the lake. And with the Legacy Amendment, we're able to secure funding to help us build up basically that endpoint and prevent erosion into the future and to keep the area for future generations.
One unique Minnesota landscape, whose surface geography is largely the result of man, is the Cuyuna Iron Range. The range is named for Cuyler Adams, a surveyor who discovered the presence of manganese iron in the region. From 1910 to the early 1980s, the commercial mining of iron ore created jobs, economic development, and towns like Crosby and Ironton.
Cuyler Adams was the founder of the Cuyuna Range. They got the name of Cuyuna from Cuyler, Una from his dog Una. Lord St. Bernard would go with him everywhere. His wife Virginia came up with the name, figuring that the name fit in with the Native American names of the area.
Cuyler Adams did a lot of work around here, and Cuyuna Range had manganiferous iron ore, which was good for steel making, whereas the Mesaba Range had very little, if any. And that's really what kept this range going, was the fact that it had manganese. The Kennedy mine sent out the first shipment of ore on this range. There were a lot of mining locations where people lived right next to the open pit. And at one time there were like 8,000 people that lived around Crosby and Ironton. You know, if it wasn't for the mines, there wouldn't be a town.
Years ago, the mining companies left here after about 70 years of industrial mining. And, you know, the area was just kind of left open. And a lot of folks, local folks would go in and use the area, you know, for their own recreation, whether it be camping or hiking. And over time, the local folks were thinking that, you know, they wanted to see that go on forever. And so they worked with the DNR and their legislature to establish, you know, a permanent recreation out here. And the Cuyuna Country State Recreation Area was formed in 1993, and this is the first recreation area established in the state park system. So we have a sharper focus on recreation out here than you'd find at state parks. We've got 16 mine lakes here that were former mine pits that, you know, open pit mining happened in. And then we have 6 natural lakes out here. So we've got a lot of lakes, and on our lakes it's real special out here because we have 26 miles basically of undeveloped shoreline, which is very unique for this part of the state. The mine lakes are very unique in that the clarity is very good. And the scuba divers, you know, from the Midwest just flock in here, and this is some of the best scuba diving in the Midwest. And once we got a good land base going out here, we started doing some development. We built a 7-mile Cuyuna Lake State Trail, a paved trail going from Riverton to Crosby. And then we also had our big project 2 years ago where we built 25 miles of mountain bike trails that are tremendously popular right now. The mining companies left just dozens of beautiful overlooks up to 200 feet tall because they would dig, you know, 500 feet deep in some of these mine pits, and they'd stack up the overburden, and then they'd stack up some of the ore that wasn't marketable. And the mountain bike trails wind in and out of those overlooks and up and down those, and provide some great vistas of the mine lakes and the surrounding area that you don't find in this part of the state where it's typically fairly flat. The mountain bike trails, you know, most of them are a red surface, you know, from the iron ore. And that's kind of a signature around here because as the bikers are out there riding on the red trails, they get the red on their tires. And so as you see them on the highway going up and down the highway, you can tell if they've been to Cuyuna or not by the redness of their tires.
You know, they talk about shred the red. The red hard pack trail, just phenomenal, fast, challenging, technical, you name it, it's there. The terrain is nice. It's up and down, it's left and right, it's rolling. The rocks are gorgeous, the quartz gorgeous. The hardwoods, the pines. I don't see how you could beat it.
We had 15,000 mountain bikers out here last year for the first season, and we were quite happy about that.
There's a reason why people say this is one of the top 10 in the nation, and I believe every bit of that. It's that good, and it's an approachable adventure that almost anyone can take on. Anyone who doesn't take advantage of this is really missing out on one of the coolest places in the state.
We got the Croft Mine Historical Park, which operated, I think, from 1914 to 1933, and that was a shaft mine.
There'd be, at this site, usually 50 men underground and 25 men above ground per shift in 2 shifts a day. So they were a 24-hour-a-day operation. Top side or above ground would be everything from support of cutting timbers to size out here, running the equipment on top, also running the engine house, which would have the air compressors, the water pumps for the bilge pumps, and then the pulley system with cables, all coal burning. So they had to have men employed just to shovel the coal to feed those big steam engines. This is a model showing the diagram of the mine here. They had the main shaft where the water would go up and down, the air lines would go through there, miners went up and down, and the iron ore buckets would be brought up and down there. Smaller one's a timber shaft to bring all the timbers or cribbing in to support the walls and ceilings in the mines. With 2 shafts, they can circulate air by forcing air down the main shaft. It flow across tunnels, flow up the timber shaft. The wide lines going across are main tunnels called drifts. They're 100 feet from floor to floor. Then between these working areas of 10-feet increments were sublevels or subdrifts. And that's where a lot of the mining is done, is bringing ore from the sublevels down into the main levels or main drifts over to the shaft and then bring it up and out of the mine. This is the work area. After blasting, they come in, knock all the loose ore down with picks and hammers, scrape it to the opening with this little blade in the corner and the big winch. Together they pull the ore to the opening of the work area where they can either shovel into carts by hand, or if there's a working level below them, dig a hole through the floor from the level below, drag the iron ore over the top, let it fall down through, filling ore cars waiting below, saving a lot of time and energy. These guys are paid piecework. By the amount of iron ore their group can get out in a 2-week period, so anything they can do to save time and energy, they did. To make a room this deep, it takes 2 blastings. They drill in 6-foot deep holes, pack them with dynamite, and only loosen up 6 to 7 feet of rock. This is a long ear core drill. It's a sampling drill, taking out a piece of rock like this in 5 and 10-foot long sections. That way they can tell how deep the ore is and whether it's worth going after or not. To keep these bits cool, they'd pump water right off the floor, pump it through the casing, and cools off the bits and also does cut down on some of the dust produced by these drills. There'd be a lot of dust produced by the drilling in the mines. These guys would be covered in dust when they come out of the mines. This is a memorial to the Milford Mine disaster. It's the largest mining disaster in Minnesota's history. On February 5th, 1924, Foley Lake dropped into the Milford Mine just 15 minutes before the end of a shift, trapping 41 miners down in it. 7 others were able to crawl up ladders and escape. It took them 1 day short of 9 months to get all 41 bodies out. And then about 3 years later, they opened it back up and ran it for 4 more years because of the manganese content of the iron ore there.
I'm glad the town is recovering due to tourism and that, because there is no iron.
We're just using what was left over after the mining companies left and taking advantage of that. And that provides some of the most unique landscapes in Minnesota.
A noteworthy event in Minnesota's history was aviator Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927. The resulting excitement generated much interest in Lindbergh's hometown of Little Falls. What was once Lindbergh's boyhood home is now Charles A. Lindbergh State Park and Historic Site, named in honor of the aviator's father.
Charles Sr., which is Charles August Lindbergh, is the father of the famous aviator Charles Augustus Lindbergh. So it's not a true senior-junior, but they're often referred to in that way. And so he's the one that Lindbergh State Park is named after.
Here at Lindbergh Park, we get a little over 6,000 campers and a little bit more than 40,000 day use visitors every year.
The park is established after Charles, the aviator, makes his famous flight, but he wants it in honor of his father because his father was a congressman representing this region of Minnesota out in Washington, D.C. for 10 years, between 1906 and 1916. C.A. Lindbergh was a politician and lawyer. He moves to Little Falls in the 1880s. He grows up in Melrose, but is actually born in Sweden. He becomes a very successful lawyer. That's where he makes a lot of his money and is able to afford that larger house on the river.
Charles Lindbergh Jr. spent a lot of his younger years growing up walking around the same land area that we're on right now, and he spent a lot of time in the family home, which is across the street.
The family moves here in 1901 and establishes the first house, which burns to the ground in 1905. So they rebuild the second house, which is what we currently have, and that house was designed as a summer home because they're going back and forth to Washington, D.C. every winter during the congressional season. So it's really small, it's simple. They called it camp. So starting in 1916, they plan on living here year-round between 1917 and 1920 when Charles leaves for college. Charles ran the farm during those latter years, and then he does graduate in 1918 and continues to run the farm for the next couple of years. And so they've got dairy cows, some cropland, but it's mostly pasture on the farm. Geese, chickens, they had goats for a short period of time, pigs. Typical farm. It's not a very successful farm. I think we'd call it more of a large hobby farm today. Key features of the house, it's a story-and-a-half bungalow. Charles's favorite spots, I'd say, were the kitchen is where the family spent a lot of time. There's a lot of evidence in the kitchen of him as a young boy, axe marks in the floor, his secret hiding place, things like that in there. And then also the sleeping porch, the back porch, I think is another key spot. It's where he really connected with nature. He slept out there year-round, never had storm windows up. It was always just the open screens. But it's here on the farm that we really think as an older adult he became involved with the environment because he really, from the wings of his airplane, he saw the world change and had that really strong connection here on the farm. The park features, one of the highlights back there is Pikes Creek. There's a bridge there today, but there's signage around it because originally Charles had a little bridge made out of barbed wire and wood because that's where the sheep pasture was on the other side of the creek. So he needed a way to get across back and forth. So over the years they've made it safer and larger, but it's still in that same spirit of what Charles started. And also way in the back is a field where in the 1920s, after he had become an aviator, but before his famous flight, Charles was a barnstormer. And so he landed his Jenny out there, which is a World War I surplus biplane that his father actually purchased for him and got him started in his aviation career. C.A. really didn't know what to think about his son becoming an aviator. He got a chance to fly with him a couple of times. But wasn't too thrilled with the idea. But he was very supportive, though, of his son. Charles Sr. passed away in 1924, so he never lives to see his son make that famous flight in 1927. It became a park in 1931 because visitors started coming here. And there was no visitor center. The house was abandoned by that point. Charles and his mother leave it in 1920 when he goes off to college. The family worried about safety. The citizens of Little Falls really felt that it was an important place to have. It was putting them on the map. So there was a core group of citizens pretty much in 1927 who started to work towards establishing a park or something here to help protect the site. And that was finally put into place in 1931 is when it opened for the first time.
Today, Charles Lindbergh State Park has 570 acres, 8 miles of trails, 38 drive-in campsites, 2 canoe and backpack campsites, and mainly people come to the park here to camp, picnic, or hike, or check out the historic site.
Well, with the park, the reason it exists is because of Charles's love for nature. You know, he recognized it as an important place, not only just to protect his boyhood home, but he grew up hearing stories from his dad. When C.A. was young, there was game aplenty. He was responsible for every shot and hunting for the family. If he missed, he had to get 2 with the next one or get a deer so that there was enough food on the table. But C.A. would tell his son stories of the sky being black because there were so many ducks flying across. And Charles didn't have that when he was a boy. And so I think hearing those stories growing up here on the Mississippi River really influenced that later environmentalism in the 50s, 60s, right through his death in 1974. He helped establish wildlife preserves all over the world, but most is known for Voyageurs National Park here in northern Minnesota. The house separated from the state park in about 1969, and that's when it was felt through management of the DNR and the Minnesota Historical Society that the house would be better cared for by MHS rather than DNR. So we got the 17 acres on this side of the road, and so have a very close relationship with the state park today, but two separate entities.
The state park here is just, you know, it's almost right in town, and so that's one thing. Another thing that's unique about Lindbergh is that we're pretty close to town, but it's kind of like a small slice of the Northwoods that's right in Little Falls. That's what people like about the park. And so I'd suggest, you know, if you haven't already, to go out to a nearby state park and check it out. I really think that Minnesota state parks are a good way to connect people with the wilderness in Minnesota, and also a lot of good historical aspects as well.
I think what people are looking for is that connection between themselves and nature.
I think that people are engaged to get outdoors just based on something that's innate within them. We have a drive to be outside and to see things and interact with our environment. That's part of us naturally.
It's important for us to appreciate the natural resources around us. When we start to remove ourselves from nature, I feel that we remove ourselves from the very existence of being a human, and just those simple things of survival.
I think it's very important for people to understand what's around them because it's where we live.
The world we have is all we have to live in.
Anything and everything that's around us affects us, and we in turn affect it.
We have a pretty good understanding of how some things work, but we don't understand everything, and if we don't preserve those things, they'll be lost.
Special places, though, are everywhere, even in our own backyards, and I feel that having places like a state park help bring us back and connect us to nature, and also that inquisitive side, that humans are just always curious, and it's a wonderful place to learn, to reach out and to kind of touch that wild side that all of us have within.
It's important to have historic sites preserved and set aside. There are many values to Minnesota state parks, and when you really look at all of the history, I think it brings the land alive.
Boardwalks to Bike Paths was made possible by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund.
If you enjoyed watching this program online, please make a tax-deductible contribution at lptv.org. Your support is what makes this web content possible. Thank you.